And then there's our fireplace that's fake. Anyway, we have our stockings up and on. We got our house decorated for Christmas. And you just wouldn't believe it. We're going to have to get extensions if this keeps going, because we have 20 of them out there now. And actually, Yvonne's and mine are off to the side because there's no room in the inn. So, pretty excited about today being our family. I'm glad that you're here. We are in a series called Christian, and we're talking about this word Christian, and we know, and if you've been here for a while, sorry, a little bit repetitive, but I want to get everybody on the same page. We have realized that the word Christian really is not a biblical term. It's only actually found 3 times in Scripture, and all 3 times it is used by those outside the church to describe those inside the church. The word Christian was never used by Christ followers to describe themselves. It is a word, in fact, that Jesus never used to describe those who followed him. The word that Jesus gave them and the word they called themselves was disciples. And the question that we've been asking is, what is a disciple? And Jesus defined it very specifically for us in John 13. He says this, "By this will everyone know you are my disciples." And here's the litmus test, the definitive statement, the qualifying characteristic of one who is his disciples. He said this, "If you love one another." And in that same conversation, Jesus says this. He says, "And by the way, this is how I want you to love one another. I want you to love one another as I have loved you." And we've been talking in this series, what does that look like? And more specifically, how does Jesus love? Because we said when you open up the Gospels and you begin to study and look how Jesus loved, what you find is that you find it's not only overwhelming, it's a little bit confusing. It's confusing because of a tension that seems to exist. 2 words that describe who Jesus is that seem to be in direct conflict with each other. And in the Gospel of John, John uses a very specific terminology to describe this tension that all of us will encounter throughout our spiritual journey. And this is what he writes, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we have seen the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father." And here there's 2 words that tend to bump heads, full of grace and truth. And what we've been saying in this is that it's like this, that Jesus comes and he has grace and truth, and they're opposites of one another. For example, truth says something like this, this is right and this is wrong and this is how you ought to live, and if you don't, you need to know you're going to be held accountable. That's true. And then grace comes to us and says, you are forgiven. Grace says you are fine. And truth says, no, you are flawed. Grace says, no matter what you do, I love you. Truth says, this is wrong and it's got to change. Grace says that you're a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come. And yet the truth says, the good I want to do, I do not do, and the evil I do not want to do, that I end up doing. And so you have these seem to be contradictions. They seem to conflict. And you want to ask Jesus, okay, which is it? Is it grace or is it truth? And the answer is it's both. And it's kind of like, you need to understand, these 2 kind of crash heads throughout the New Testament. I'm looking for something specific here in my pocket. Here it is. Okay, it's kind of like a silver dollar, okay? A silver dollar. It has 2 sides. And whenever you flip, whether it's heads or tails, you still got a buck. It doesn't change because of which side lands. And it's the same way with the character of Jesus. There are 2 sides to his character, but they're both Jesus. And they're the same. We see these conflict again when you study and begin to understand what the gospel says. For example, when you look at God, you look at the gospel message and you hear, again, 2 contradictory kind of statements. You read, for example, in 1 John 4:8, it says point blank, God is love. If you love, it's from God because God is love. In Jeremiah, it says this, I have loved you with a love that lasts forever. I have kept on loving you with faithful love. And because he loves us, and that's grace, God doesn't want to punish us. And that seems, oh, good. But then there's this other side of God that's truth, that is about righteousness, that's about not having sin. And so we read a truth statement like this. Not one person has God's approval. No one has understanding. No one searches for God. Everyone has turned away. Together they have become rotten to the core. Really encouraging. No one does anything good, not even one person. So we have this thing that says, I love you with an everlasting love, it never fails. And then the other side that says, God says, by the way, I will by no means clear the guilty. And we're guilty. We're sinners. We fall short. And so here's the deal. It seems like you have these two things, these two characteristics, they're opposite, and they're bumping heads all the time. So on one side we find a God who loves us and doesn't want to punish us, and the other side we find a God who is just and right, and therefore He must. And so we get this tension when John writes, we have seen the glory of the one and only Son, full of grace and truth. And what we did a couple weeks ago is we showed that, how you take these two and you blend them together to the brim, and it's not about percentages. We said it's not like God's half grace and half truth. He's 100% truth and 100% grace, full to the brim with both. And that creates a tension. It creates a big tension. Now, I'm just catching up here a little bit here. I want you to understand, we understand that Jesus is full to the brim of both. They seem to conflict each other, but they don't. And He somehow lives in such a way that He answers to the both fully and completely. And we're just not sure how that works. And that's where it gets a bit confusing. But it's on top of that John adds these words a little bit later. He says, it's out of this fullness, this completeness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. What does that mean? Literally in the Greek what it means is this. We've all received grace upon grace upon grace upon grace upon grace. And it's a grace that's never ending, never done, always coming, always flowing into our lives. And John wants to understand how important that is, because then he qualifies that statement by saying this. For the law, we talked about this last week, the 10 Commandments, the 600 commandments they piled on top of that. The law was given. It was given, and this is important, from Moses, through Moses. It was given through Moses. And the law tells us what God expects and what to do when we fall short. The law, and that's where God says, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt really not, okay? And if thou doest, thou must go to the temple and make it right by giving an offering, an atonement for sin. The law was given through Moses, and then John draws this line in the sand. It seems to be, he makes this huge distinction. It's like, if you read this verse in the first chapter of John's Gospel, it's almost as if he stops, he's writing, and he pulls the pen back, and he sits back in a chair, and he's thinking, okay, how can I word this? How do I put this on paper? How do I communicate this in such a way that they won't miss it, they'll get it? And he says this, he says, for the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came, and we said that word came as the word begotten, it's the word born. It communicates the idea that was full and complete. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, I'm sorry, I hit this thing once in a while, and I think I'm playing with the chord here, so if I don't hear myself, you guys say, hey, I can't hear you, and it sounds better. So John says it's not about the balance between these two. It's the full measure of. It's not about the balance of these two. It's the fact that Jesus was the embodiment of both. So John wants to understand that we don't separate these two, because it's not one or the other, it's both and. And last week we made this statement, we made it the week before. And what you're saying, when we personally encounter Jesus Christ, when we have this personal encounter, from our vantage point, it always looks, from our vantage point, overwhelmingly all about grace. Because we get it. And so I want to talk a little bit about that vantage point a little bit further today. By giving you two examples of where we start to understand why this personal encounter makes it seem just all about grace when it's actually both and. One day Jesus is walking along, okay? He's walking along and he has this interaction with a tax collector. Last week we talked about Samaritans, we talked about how they were half-breeds, we talked about how people judged them and wrote them off. I apologize if I seem like I oversold that. I was told that I kind of came off cynical, really down on those people. But what I was trying to communicate is how those people were viewed in the first century. And they weren't viewed squinty-eyed. Samaritans were not looked at. They were despised. They were a walking billboard of a life gone wrong. They were a walking billboard that somebody, and a Samaritan was a half-breed. It was a Jew who stepped outside the family of God, out of Judaism, and out of that was an offspring.
And so, sadly, that person would be treated wrong, not for what they did, but for what their parents did. But that's kind of how it ran back, how they ruled back in that day. So we would probably conclude after last week that the bottom of the social ladder was Samaritans, and that would be wrong, because in the first century Jewish culture, there was a rung below the Samaritans, if you please, and that was tax collectors. Tax collectors. I mean, they're hated today, but they were really hated back in that day. And the reason was because the tax collectors are referred to are their own people. They were Jews hired by the Romans to sell out their own people. And they would hire these Jews because they would know them, okay? And they would know their families. And so they would pick somebody out of the community who knew people and would make sure that the money was not collected. If people went hiding, they would seek them out. But what they would do is they would not only collect the taxes they owed the Roman Empire, they would add a little bit to pad their own pockets. So essentially, they sold out their people for personal gain. And because of that, they were hated. The Jews considered tax collectors to be the ultimate Benedict Arnolds, backstabbers, traitors, and turncoats. And this is a culture that likes to put people in categories. So once you were in a category, you were bagged and tagged, and there was no chance to move out of it. And so I want you to understand, there were Samaritans, there were sinners, but it's interesting, the Bible says often you'll hear them say, tax collectors and sinners. There's sinners, but then there's the sinners. And so understand, they're the bottom of the rung in the social ladder. So Jesus walking along one day with his disciples, and some of you know the story, and Jesus stops and he strikes up this conversation with the tax collector. And this guy wasn't your average run-of-the-mill tax collector. He was like the CEO. He was kind of the president of the I put down JTCU, the Jewish Tax Collecting Organization. And he was the top dog. So this guy was really well known, and he was bagged and tagged, and he was absolutely hated because he was kind of, again, the poster child of this group. But this big man was a wee little man. Now, you remember the story? And he was short. How short was he? Well, he was so short that he could not see Jesus because of the crowd. So he ran, there's this entourage, this crowd gathering as Jesus is walking along. So he runs ahead of them, and he climbs up, remember, a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And you know the story. Jesus is walking along, looks up, and he sees, he thought it was a cat. No, he said, there's a cat. No, that's a man. And he stops, and he begins to strike up this conversation with Zacchaeus. We'll just call him Zach. Now, I don't know what else is happening. I don't know if people were kind of talking to each other, but I want you to imagine that Jesus is talking. He's got this tax collector. The tax collector's come down from the tree. He's climbed down, and he's interacting, having a conversation with this chief of sinners, the tax collector. And I can kind of see he's talking to this tax collector, and the disciples are kind of talking amongst themselves, and some of the crowd, hey! And all of a sudden they look over and they say, oh man! Well, the guy sees Jesus talking to Zacchaeus, the head of the tax collector, and he grabs the place, oh man, let's go save him. And they're not talking about the tax collector, so they run over to Jesus just as Jesus is finishing up the conversation, and he turns, and these disciples are saying, Jesus, I don't know if you knew it or not, but he's one of those. Jesus, I think Jesus said to him, you mean one of those short people? No. He's one of those. He's short, yeah, but that's not, he's a tax collector. I mean, they probably said, he's a tax collector. And Jesus probably went, no. Yeah, I knew, gotcha. Psych. Yeah, I know. And they're like, no, Jesus, he's a tax collector. Now, while they're saying that, you gotta remember that one of their own, Matthew, was a tax collector. He's retired now. And he's traveling with Jesus, but he's a tax collector. And I'm sure they said, no, he's a tax collector, you know, one of those scum. Oh, sorry, Matthew. No offense. No offense taken. But he's a tax collector. And Jesus, I don't think this is good. I mean, you're talking to this tax collector. No offense, Matthew. No offense taken. It's just not a good idea, man, because it's going to hurt your reputation. It's going to damage your ministry. It's going to call into question your character. Because if you're talking to him, if you're actually you're giving him voice, credibility, you're recognizing him as a person, and people might be thinking you approve of what he does. So for the sake of the ministry, We just kind of like to suggest to you, don't be, rubbing shoulders with those kind of people. And I think Jesus kind of smiled and said, well, if you're really concerned about public perception and approval ratings, I got some bad news. It's going to get worse. Well, what do you mean? Well, we're all going to his house later today for beer and brats. When the paparazzi sees that, it's going to be all over the place. In fact, I think our approval rating is going to tank. And he said, you think that's bad? I told him to invite all his tax collector friends and their friends. It's going to be wall-to-wall sinners and tax collectors and us. Jesus, when you do that, man, you know you're hurting us. You're killing your reputation. And I think Jesus kind of pauses. He says, well, who do you think I've come to save? And later, after the story, at the end of the story, he tells him, he says this, for the Son of Man, I have come to seek and save what was lost. The tax collector was rejected by his own people because of the choice that he made, choosing money over his own people. He is lonely. It's not like he's on the periphery of social life. He is out of bounds. He is way out in the field on his own. He's been rejected. He's a marked man. He's a hated man. He's the guy that when he parks his donkey, they let the air out of the hoof. Okay, it's like his house is the one that gets soaked in teepee. I just want you to know he is a marked man. And I want you to understand, he chose that vocation. It was his choice. He understands the cost. But you got to trust me, I'm sure it's painful. And yet, this is important, because I want you to catch this. God steps towards him, steps toward him. Jesus initiates a relationship with him. He extends grace to Zach. And as a result, Zach's life is completely changed, almost immediately at that interaction at the foot of that tree. And you say, how do you know that? Because the first words out of his mouth, I shouldn't say the first words, but very shortly after this conversation, he says this, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay them back 4 times the amount. And that's a huge pivot in a completely opposite direction from this man's life and character. It's a guy who deserves boundless punishment and rejection. To be left out. To be ignored. To be written off. But he gets grace. And it stops him in his tracks and it changes his heart. Second illustration from Scripture. If you're familiar with the Easter event and you know that Jesus was crucified, you know that he was crucified between 2 common thieves. And so, it's interesting, sometimes people call them common thieves, but they weren't common thieves, they weren't petty thieves, they were the worst of the worst. They didn't put to death petty criminals. They put to death those of whom there was no hope. These guys were habitual criminals, and they could not be rehabilitated. They would not be sent as slaves into the mines to work the mines because they couldn't be trusted. They would be a problem there. They couldn't be left in prison because they'd be a problem there. They were a threat to society if they would ever escape or get out. And therefore, they had to be taken out. And that's why they were judged, found guilty, and condemned to die. So, if you pardon a few of these little puns. So while they're hanging out there, with time to kill, one of these 2 criminals, if you read the account, especially out of Luke, starts trash-talking Jesus. Here's a guy who's going to die. Okay? He's hanging there. It's not like, I'll trash Jesus and they'll let me go. He just starts trashing on Jesus. What is that about? The guy's in his final hours of his life for a crime that he's being punished rightly for his life. He's a failure. And yet he trashes on Jesus. While he's doing that, go figure, who does that? While he's insulting Jesus, the other guy on the other side of the cross gets in his face. And he says something nice. He says, you know what? He says this, hey, we're getting the same punishment as this guy, and you're trashing on him. And the truth is, we deserve this, and he does not. And on the heels of rebuking the other criminal, he turns to Jesus, this man, and says this, Jesus, I deserve what I'm getting. I'm a loser. I made my choice. I'm guilty. It's funny because you would think maybe Jesus, being the good guy he is, would say, no, you're getting a bad rap. You've got a good heart. The deck of life was stacked against you, you know? You didn't have a good home life. You grew up in the wrong neighborhood. You didn't get the breaks or the opportunities. A couple of bad things came your way. You took in some bad company, and nah, you're a good man. And Jesus doesn't do that. The guy says, we're getting what we deserve. And I think Jesus says, I'm arguing with you there. But he says this. He goes, you know, Jesus, I deserve this and you don't. But do me a favor. Lord, please remember me when you enter your paradise. And what's Jesus' response? He says this, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise. He says to this criminal, this convict, this sinner, this man who walked his own 3 mile that day, a man who went to the cross that he deserved, that he earned, condemned by the Roman Empire, weighed by his own people and found wanting, who lived a failed life. He is getting his just desserts, if you please. And Jesus says to that guy, when you breathe your last, and I breathe my last, we're going to be together. I won't forget you. Now, I grew up in the church. The more conservative the church, the more the chance is that people sending the appeal would go, whoa, that's just not right. Whoa, 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 you got to be kidding me. Jesus, you got to be kidding me. That guy gets to be with you in paradise? Jesus, just a couple of chapters ago, we had this guy, this rich, young ruler came to you, asked an honest answer. He said, what do I need to do to get into paradise with you? And you said, hey, no problem, you can be with me. And then you said this to this rich, young ruler. You said, get this, you said, yeah, you can be with me, but here's what you got to do. You got to go and give everything away, give it to the poor, and then for the rest of your life you have to follow me, that's all. And that guy had potential. He had voice, he had influence. You keep hanging out with this riffraff, these sinners, these tax collectors. Sorry, Matthew, no offense taken. That guy had potential, and he had money. And Lord knows our account could use more money. And we've been eating at McDonald's. It'd be nice to go to the Green Gateau, or you know, the Blue Orchid, or Wilderness Ridge, or something. And we could wine and dine. He'd get us into some different kind of people. He'd give your ministry credibility. And you tell him he's got to sell everything, give to the poor, and follow you for the rest of this life. And this thief, which is an understatement of his character, that doesn't even remotely come close to the kind of man he is. He's a creep. He's a public menace. He's barely a notch above the tax collector on the sin scale. Sorry, Matthew, no offense taken. And he's got one tick on his life clock. I mean, how does that work? Okay, like he's going to say, okay, Jesus, right, I will follow you for the rest of my life. I will do right by you for the rest of my life. He's got 2 ticks on his life clock. That's not right. It's not fair. He can't rededicate his life. Forgive me, Lord, I'll never sin again. I mean, he's dead within the hour. This is a deathbed conversion. It doesn't seem fair. Do you see how this tension works sometimes? We see stuff like that. When we see things happen we don't like it, we don't get what God is doing, we don't like it doing. Wait, next week, don't miss next week's messages. So I just absolutely love the content, especially on this point, how so many Christians are angry because they want bad people to suffer. Because they're wondering, why do good people suffer and the bad seem to go unpunished? And we love to ask this question, that's not fair, or make the statement. I just had somebody ask me on chatting with them, and they just really had a really disheartening situation happened, and they said, I don't get it. That God is supposed to be loving and all-powerful. Why are there children starving in third world countries, let alone here in our own country? And why does it seem like good people that always are running up against the wall and not succeeding, and people who have no love and no compassion and no desire for God at all seem to be succeeding? We ask that question all the time. And I'll tell you what I told her. She goes, explain that to me. And I said, can't. That question's been around since time began being recorded. I think ever since man walked down the garden, we've been asking that question. We want to cry foul. And this situation with the thief seems to be foul. So God, tell me. I think we want Jesus to tell me, which is it, grace or truth? Tell me which one. I'll embrace it. And Jesus says both and. And it doesn't seem to be fair. Last week we looked at the woman caught in adultery, remember? They bring her to Jesus to be stoned. They said the law requires that she be stoned. She was caught in adultery. We talked about how there's huge pieces missing in the story. Like if she's caught in adultery, we've only got 50% of the problem in front of us. But it wasn't about the woman. It wasn't about adultery. It wasn't about stoning her. It was about tricking and trapping Jesus. By trying to get him to say something that went against the law. Therefore, the religious leaders could write him off and maybe even put him away or have him put to death. And Jesus actually turns the law back on them and says, you're right, she should be stoned, she's a sinner, this is terrible. Whoever is without sin, let them throw that first stone. Go for it. And you remember, over a period of time, you can hear the rocks drop, and soon everyone's gone except for Jesus and this crumbled woman, this person of humanity, broken, defeated, thinking death is imminent. And remember, Jesus gets down, he lifts her up, and he brushes the dirt off of her and moves the hair from her eyes and her wipes away her tears. And he demonstrates compassion, and he tenderly looks in her eye, and he simply says this. He says, who accuses you? And she looks around. She didn't even realize everybody was gone. She just thought she was going to die. She goes, there's no one. He goes, and he says these remarkable words to her. He says, then neither do I condemn you. That's grace. He says, go now and leave your life of sin. That's truth. And obviously we know, as we talked about last week, she's going to sin again because she breathes. That's part of our journey. We don't get perfection until we enter into the paradise and we leave this place. Until then, we're going to be fighting and wrestling with the old man. But he gives both grace. He says, leave your life of sin. Did he have to say that? Yes. Why? Because God is constantly giving us the law to tell us, don't go there, don't go there, don't go there. Not so he can whack us, but because he knows if we go there, there's a gotcha in sin. And when he plays it out, he says, don't let sin get you, but it already kind of has gotcha. But if you go there, there's going to be a cost. You're going to be less than you are and experience less than I give. And you're going to experience less in relationships. You're going to be less than the person I created you to be. So don't go there. So he gives us the law to tell us, don't find life there, you find life in me. But we go there. And then he gives us grace, because grace is our ticket home. Grace is the thing that reminds us now, yes, I need to be reconnected where life comes from. So that's why he gives us both. Jesus says, love one another. And how does he love? He loves this way. We said this last week, but I want you to get it again. He called sin, sin, and then he paid for it. And then having paid for it, he says, I don't condemn you. And then after saying, I don't condemn you, he says, now I've called sin, sin, and paid for it, and I don't condemn you, but I don't want you to try to live over here in sin. So leave your life of sin. And then the remarkable part of that is this. He says this, and if you don't, I love you. And if you can't, I love you. And if the woundedness and the shrapnel of your sin leads you to a place where you're not sure you'll ever be free from it and ever be able to walk away from it, and the complexity of your sin has you trapped and in bondage, and you can't get out, Jesus says, guess what? I love you. And if someone sinned against you and that action, that event, that wrong, that violation has sent you into a spiral of self-destructive behavior, and you're not sure if you'll ever recover from that, and you don't believe in yourself, you can't look in the mirror, and you're just so sure that I don't love you because you don't love yourself, Jesus says, I want you to know something. I love you. Because the truth is, you're a sinner. The grace is, I don't condemn you. But you got to have both, because if you lean one way or the other, you're going to lose something very significant. A friend sent me this text this week. He said, I was thinking about you, and I came across this reading. I was thinking about the message. He said this, it's from Tim Keller. Truth without grace is not really truth, and grace without truth is not really grace. And he's right. You need both and we said this last week. Truth is real, but grace is surreal. And from our vantage point, it always looks like more grace. And we said this last week. We said, this is you. This is your life of company. If you think I'm being judgmental, it's also me. So it's us, all right? And what happens is, it's like this. We get the truth factor here, and this is what we look at. We look at our own life, and this is what we see. We just say, I am a sinner. The good I want to do, I'm just full to the brim. Do you know the more you walk with God, the more you realize how far short you fall of what God has planned for you? I thought I'd come to Christ, and then over a period of time, life would get easier. It doesn't. I'm more aware of my failures than I am of the right steps I take. And it's easy to get caught in this I am full to the brim with not good. For all of sin. I get that. But the thing about grace is this. It comes along and starts pouring in grace. And more pouring in grace, and pouring in grace, and pouring in grace, and pouring in grace. Do you see why it looks like it's more grace? And to the point where it's overrunning, and you're going, oh yeah, but sooner or later, remember we did this last week, sooner or later it runs out. Not! Because see, it's always flowing and ever coming. And we get lost in the sea of grace. That's what it means when it says those words, grace in place of grace, and grace in place of grace, in place of grace already given. And if you can get that, and you really get that, it takes your breath away. It humbles you. It results in thanksgiving. That's why I wanted to bookend these two messages on each side of Thanksgiving. Because Thanksgiving for me, in just a few hours, Yvonne and I, true Yvonne, is it? We love having our family at the table. Our family gets at the table, we laugh, we talk, we love each other. I love family. But I want you all to understand, because we get together and we love each other, we enjoy family. But communion, okay, breaking bread is about coming to the table and enjoying family, but more importantly, enjoying God out of thanksgiving for grace. Do you see why from our vantage point, it always looks like a whole lot more grace than law? It's funny though, it's the law that breaks us and grace that completes us. It's the law that empties us and grace that fills us. It's the law that leads to despair. And it's grace that leads to life. And that's how it works. I want to give you this verse, and here's why. Because it's Thanksgiving. We're going to do something that always scares me a little bit. It's too hot. We have an open mic here. And we're going to sing a song. And then if you would like to get up and just say, I want to just say what I'm thankful for today or this year. And just give in 1 minute. And I'd say 1 minute because sometimes somebody comes up and they're going to give a half-hour message, and I've already really milked that piece. So this is about sermonizing. This is just about being able to articulate what you're thankful for. In just about 30 seconds to a minute. So we're going to sing, and I want you to look at this verse, because out of this, this verse makes sense. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, and his courts with praise. Give thanks to God and praise his name, for the Lord is good, and his love and grace endures forever. His faithfulness and his grace continues through all generations. So we're going to give you an opportunity just to say thanks out loud to God. So I'm going to have these guys come up and give you a minute to think about it. I'm going to be up here too, just in case you get a little bit, you get the Greg factor, and you go on and on and on. I'll say, don't be a Greg, un-Greg that. And we're going to have a little bit of sharing, I hope. For those of you who are guests, in the very back wall, there is what we call the Lord's table. And it's the table of grace, just reminding us of what is ours through Christ.
for. I'll get the ball rolling. I am really thankful for all the music and love that God has put into my heart, and know that there isn't a day that I can't find comfort without that.
This is a very emotional day for our family. I'm sorry. 4 years ago today, I'm a farmer, we live in Lexington. 4 years ago today, our daughter, Rebecca, was in a car that should have killed her, but it didn't. We just finished harvest, and that's a good feeling for a farmer. About sundown, Rebecca was coming home from school and was hit in her car at an intersection. She ended up in Lincoln at Bryan Memorial, and God's hands guided some people to save her life. Sorry, I don't want, but it was 4 years ago today. And every time Thanksgiving comes, we have a reason for Thanksgiving.
We love having your daughter here, as well as your other two daughters. We used to call RiverTree homes. Anybody else?
Okay, so mine isn't really very serious, but I was thinking about it, and I am thankful for cats.
There's a story here between her and I. I think cats are an evil animal. And
And Greg.
well, I love you too, Carolyn. No, you do.
There's a few things. I'm thankful for every day, and I'm also thankful for, I guess, the trials and tribulations that I go through, because that just lets us know that God's not done with us. So I definitely am thankful for His grace.
Thanks, Charles.
Morning. I didn't know if I was going to come up. I just wanted to say that I'm thankful for a church that works the way that this one does, and that a church that understands that I understand that I'm a sinner, you know, is huge to me. It's the only reason I can be here. So, really support. Thanks.
Um, 18 months ago, I was diagnosed with mono, and it turned chronic, and I'm still dealing with it. Part of mono was also panic attacks, and I came to the end of myself, and I realized that after 46 years of life or so, I didn't like myself, and I really was very angry at God. And I didn't have much energy to do this stuff. They've been very fulfilling for me. The things that made me feel that I was worthwhile. And I just really laid it out on God and said, I've tried all my life. I became a Christian at 6 to earn your approval and to find your love, and I don't see it. And I don't know if I can trust you. And I had people say, oh, you can't say that to God. And I said, if my God can't take that, I'm not interested in having Him as a God. And over the last 18 months, He has proved Himself so faithful. I'm not done with my mono. The issues that I have otherwise are still there. But I look back at the verses that he gave me, and he's answered them, and I don't even know how. But I'm still standing here, and I have different priorities. And after 40 years of being a Christian, I actually am beginning to trust my God. And so I'm here today to be very thankful that God allowed me to get so sick that I had to come to the end of myself. So
Thanks.
All right, we'll do another one here. Feel free to come up afterwards. I really like this song a lot. It's a Michael Gunger song. It's called "You Have Me," and I think it's kind of a recurring theme. You know, as I see people coming up here a lot. I mean, it's inevitable, right? We all go through our thing in life. I mean, we all do, whatever it is. Whether you have a great life or a really challenging life, and that's kind of what this song's about a little bit. At the beginning, he's talking about how he was away from God. He's far away, and God was still there, no matter what he was going through. And he goes through that a little bit about, I was here and you were there, but you were always with me. And then once it gets to the chorus and stuff, it talks about how God's always faithful, God's always good. No matter if we leave him, if we choose ourselves, you know what, I'm rejecting God now, or I don't trust him. It goes into, you know, you're always faithful, he's always good. And it strikes a chord with me, but I mean, obviously I can tell from just people talking, it strikes a chord with a lot of people, so we'll start with that. And out on the farthest edge, there in the silence, you were there. My faith was torn to shreds, my heart in the balance, you were there. Always faithful, always good. You still have me. You still have my heart. I thought I had seen the end of everything broken. You were there. I've wandered heaven's gates, I've made my bed in hell. You were there. Always faithful, always good. You still have me. You still have my heart. You have me. You have me. You have my heart completely. You have me. You have me. You have my heart completely. You have me. You have me. You
Father, we thank you for grace. And we thank you for the fact that it never stops flowing our direction. We're thankful for the law that shows us our need and for the grace that fulfills it. We're thankful for the law that reminds us we still have things we need to work on and changes that we need to make. But we thank you for grace that loves us and embraces us in the journey. I know there's a lot of people here that share today that kind of wish they would have or felt they should have, but it doesn't matter because it's spoken to you. Thanks for God that pursues us. Thanks for being a God who initiates. Thanks for being a God who completely understands our struggles and loves us anyway. And it's my prayer that during this time of the year that we will stop and we'll just say thanks. That out of grateful hearts, we want to serve you. From full hearts, we want to honor you. We love you, we thank you. We pray this in Christ's name, and God's people said, amen. Have a great week. See you next week. Next Sunday is just going to be so fun. So,